If you had walked into the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls that crisp Roman morning, you might have thought you were witnessing the most shocking breach of papal protocol in modern Vatican history. Pope Leo XIV, the man who holds the keys to the Catholic Church, wasn't standing at the ornate pulpit delivering his scheduled homily. He wasn't waving to the gathered crowd of dignitaries and press. He wasn't even kneeling in silent prayer, as protocol demanded. No, he was lying flat on the cold marble floor, face down, arms stretched wide like a crucified man, and from his lips came a name that made every Swiss guard freeze in confusion. The morning had begun, according to script, precisely at 10 o'clock. Pope Leo XIV had entered the basilica's towering nave, his white cassock flowing behind him like spilled light across the ancient stones. The golden mosaics caught the Mediterranean sun streaming through the clerestory windows, casting long shadows between the massive columns. Everything moved with Vatican precision, the choreographed steps of his entourage, the positioned cameras, the carefully vetted guest list seated in reverent silence. Cardinal Toretti, the papal master of ceremonies, carried the prepared homily. In a leather folder, each word approved by 3 committees. The speech would last exactly 12 minutes, touching on St. Paul's missionary journeys and the Church's continuing evangelization efforts. Safe, predictable, forgettable. Pope Leo XIV reached the marble steps before Paul's tomb. Something shifted. The air itself seemed to thicken. He stopped walking, and his entourage continued forward until they realized their shepherd was no longer with them. Security whispered urgently into hidden microphones. A photographer's finger hesitated over his camera's shutter. Then the Pope knelt first, one knee, then both. The marble echoed with the soft impact. Gasps rippled through the basilica like wind through wheat. Without explanation, without announcement, he lowered himself completely. Forehead pressed against the stone that had witnessed nearly 2 millennia. "Of prayer, Marco," he whispered, the name floating into the vaulted silence above. "We finished." The word hung in the air like incense, foreign and sacred. Cardinal Toretti's folder slipped from his trembling hands, the prepared homily scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. Somewhere in the back pews, a young priest from Bosnia began to weep. Though he couldn't yet understand why, the papal apartments at Santa Marta had never felt smaller to Pope Leo XIV. Paul's basilica, he sat alone at his simple wooden desk, the same one he'd insisted on keeping despite Vatican protocol suggesting something more ornate. The Roman sky beyond his window was still draped in darkness, but sleep had abandoned him. Hours ago, his hands trembled slightly as he opened the bottom drawer, not from age or infirmity, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Inside, wrapped in faded linen that had traveled with him through 3 decades and 4 countries, lay a small wooden cross, crude, handmade, the kind a carpenter might fashion in his spare moments between building tables and mending doors. The wood was stained dark in places, not from age but from blood that had dried there 28 years ago in a seminary courtyard half a world away. Pope Leo XIV lifted it carefully, his thumb tracing the uneven edges where a penknife had carved. The initials MJ into the base, Marco Giovannovi, a name the Vatican had never heard. A man the Church had never canonized. A saint who had died with sawdust in his hair and forgiveness on his lips. The cross fit perfectly in his palm, just as it had when Marco first pressed it there during those last terrifying minutes in Bosnia. "Keep this," Marco had whispered, pressing it into the young priest's hands while explosions echoed outside. "Remember that some things are worth dying for, but love is the only thing worth living for." A soft knock interrupted his reverie. "Your Holiness," came the voice of Father Benedetti, his personal secretary. "The motorcade will be ready in 30 minutes. "Thank you," Pope Leo XIV replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. He didn't mention that there would be no motorcade today, not really. There would be cameras and protocol and the carefully orchestrated dance of papal ceremony. But beneath the white cassock, beneath the centuries of tradition, there would only be a man keeping a promise to a friend who had saved 17 lives before losing his own. He slipped the cross into the hidden pockets sewn into his vestments, right above his heart. Today, the Vatican would witness something unprecedented. Today, Pope Leo XIV would do what no pontiff in modern history had dared. He would break protocol for love. The weight of the cross against his chest felt like an anchor, or perhaps like wings. In the spring of 1995, the seminary of St. Cyril in Sarajevo had become something it was never meant to be, a fortress of the desperate. Father Markovic, who would one day become Pope Leo XIV, arrived there not by choice but by assignment, sent by his superiors in Zagreb to provide pastoral support during the crisis. The crisis, as if ethnic cleansing could be reduced to such sanitized language. The seminary's stone walls, built to house contemplation and prayer, now sheltered families who had fled burning villages with nothing but the clothes pressed against their backs. The chapel, where young men once learned to celebrate Mass, now echoed with the cries of children who no longer understood why their neighbors wanted them dead. Mothers whispered prayers in 3 languages: Bosnian, Croatian, Serbianas, if God might hear them better in their native tongue. Father Markovic was 34 then, still young enough to believe that his Roman collar might protect him from the madness consuming the Balkans. He had studied theology in comfortable classrooms, debated doctrine over wine and bread. Nothing had prepared him for the hollow eyes of a 12-year-old boy who had watched his father dragged from their home, or the silence of a grandmother who could no longer speak after seeing her village burned to ash. The seminary rector, an elderly Franciscan named Brother Thomas, moved through the chaos like a ghost wrapped in brown wool. "We are Noah's Ark now," he told Father Markovic on that first morning, gesturing toward the families huddled in every corner. "But instead of animals, we save souls, and pray that God remembers where we anchored when the waters recede." Outside the seminary walls, the city bled. Sniper fire cracked through the morning air like breaking bones. Artillery shells landed with sounds that made the earth weep. The ancient Miljaska River, which had carried trade boats and lovers' whispers for centuries, now carried bodies downstream toward a sea that had grown tired of receiving them. But inside those walls, something else was happening. A carpenter named Marco Giovannovi had appeared one morning with nothing but worn tools and calloused hands. He said little about where he'd come from or what he'd lost. Instead, he simply began building reinforcing windows, constructing makeshift beds, carving crosses from scrap wood to replace the ones lost in abandoned churches. "Why do you stay?" Father Markovic asked him one evening as shells exploded in the distance. Marco looked up from the small cross he was shaping. Wood shavings scattered around his feet like fallen prayers, because someone has to keep building while the world tears itself apart. Marco Giovannovi worked the way other men prayed with complete devotion and no expectation of reward. Each morning before dawn, Father Markovic would find him in the seminary courtyard, already measuring wood or mixing mortar with hands that moved as if guided by something deeper than muscle memory. The tools he carried were ancient past, down from his grandfather, he said, and they bore the worn smoothness of 3 generations of honest labor. "My father built churches," Marco explained one morning as he reinforced the seminary's main gate. "I learned to read by tracing letters." He carved into altar stones. He always said carpentry was just another way of serving God, making things that shelter people, that last beyond our own lives. Father Markovic watched him work, fascinated by the quiet precision. Where others saw chaos and destruction, Marco saw solutions. A broken window became an opportunity to install stronger glass. A damaged door became a chance to create something more beautiful than what was lost. He never complained about the constant sound of artillery in the distance, or the way the walls shook when shells landed too close. What struck Father Markovic most was how Marco moved among the refugee families. He would kneel beside children who had stopped speaking, showing them how to whittle small animals from wood scraps. He taught teenage boys to use hammers and saws, giving them purpose when purpose seemed extinct. When old Mrs. Popovic wept for her murdered son, Marco simply sat beside her, his presence a wordless testament that grief shared was grief diminished. "You could leave," Father Markovic said one evening, as they shared a meager dinner of bread and thin soup. "Your skills any construction crew in Zagreb would hire you. You could build houses for people who pay in real money instead of gratitude." Marco carved a small cross from a piece of oak, his knife moving with practiced strokes. "Christ was a carpenter too," he said softly. "I don't think he spent much time worrying about payment. He paused, testing the smoothness of the wood with his thumb. "Besides these people, they're not refugees, Father. They're my neighbors. When your neighbor's house burns down, you don't abandon them. You help them build another." Marco carved a small cross from a piece of oak, his knife moving with practiced strokes. His thumb, "Besides these people, they're not refugees, Father. They're my neighbors." The simplicity of his logic made Father Markovic's throat tighten. Here was sanctity without sermons, faith without fanfare. Every nail Marco drove was a prayer. Every board he cut was an act of hope. Outside, the war raged on. Inside, one man quietly built tomorrow, June 15, 1995, began with an unusual silence that made Father Markovic's skin crawl. No birds sang in the seminary courtyard. No children played between the makeshift beds. Even the distant rumble of artillery had ceased, as if the entire city held its breath. The families huddled closer together, mothers clutching their children. With the instinct of prey sensing predators, Marco had been reinforcing. The chapel doors, when the first explosion shattered the evening air, not distant this time, close enough to rain plaster from the ceiling and send the oil lamps swaying like hanged men. "Get everyone into the chapel," he shouted to Father Markovic, his voice cutting through the screams that erupted from every corner of the seminary. "The walls are thicker there." The attackers came like wolves in the night boots pounding against stone, voices shouting orders in languages that had once been neighbors' tongues, but now carried only hatred. Flashlights swept through windows like searchlights, hunting escaped prisoners. Somewhere in the darkness, automatic weapons chattered their deadly percussion. Father Markovic herded families toward the chapel, his heart hammering against his ribs. A young mother stumbled, her infant wailing in her arms. An elderly man leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, moving too slowly, too vulnerable. Behind them, boots grew louder on the corridor stones. "Father?" Marco's voice cut through the chaos. He stood at the chapel's entrance, his carpenter's hammer in one hand, a small wooden cross in the other. "Take them inside. Bar the door. Don't open it until morning, no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Father Markovic reached for him, but Marco stepped backward into the courtyard. "Someone needs to buy you time." Marco pressed the wooden cross into Father Markovic's palm, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "Keep this, remember that. Some things are worth dying for, but love is the only thing worth living for." The chapel door slammed shut. Father Markovic heard the scrape of furniture being dragged across the entrance, Marco barricading them inside from the outside, trapping himself with the approaching wolves. Through the thick stone walls came the sound of shouting. Then gunfire. Then a silence more terrible than any scream. When dawn finally crept through the chapel's stained glass windows, Father Markovic found Marco in the courtyard, lying beside the statue of St. Francis. His hammer lay broken beside him, but his face held an expression of perfect peace. Seminary of St. Cyril looked nothing like the manicured gardens of Vatican graveyards that Father Markovic had known. Here, beneath a sky still gray with smoke, 17 wooden crosses stood crooked in the hard-packed, earth-hastily carved markers for hastily dug graves. No marble angels wept here. No Latin inscriptions proclaimed eternal rest. Only names, scratched into rough wood with whatever tools the survivors could find. Father Markovic knelt beside the cross that bore the simple inscription, MJ 1961 to 1995. His hands still shook as he pressed Marco's wooden cross into the dirt at the base of the grave. The international observers had come and gone, their clipboards filled with statistics that would become footnotes in history books. 17 dead, 43 survivors. Another incident in the Bosnian conflict, numbers that could never capture. The sound of Marco's hammer, or the gentleness in his calloused hands. Something the world would forget, but heaven would remember. He gave us time to hide, to pray, to live. Father Markovic stared at the fresh earth, his vision blurred by tears that had taken 3 days to finally come. The wooden cross Marco had carved lay half buried now, its rough edges already beginning. 2. Whether this man who had built shelter for the desperate, who had taught children to carve hope from scraps of wood, who had laid down his life for neighbors, the church would never canonize him. History would never remember his name, but Father Markovic would. He placed his hand on the grave and spoke words that would echo in his heart for the next 28 years. "The church you served so humbly, I will lay down for you." I will speak your name where the world can hear it. I will remember what the Church forgets, that sanctity lives in sawdust and sacrifice, not in ceremony and gold. The promise settled into his bones like a fever that would never break. Around him, the survivors began their slow journey toward uncertain futures, refugee camps, distant relatives, countries that might or might not welcome them. But Father Markovic remained kneeling, his hand pressed to the earth that held his friend. His teacher, his saint, the wooden cross grew warm beneath his palm, as if Marco's spirit had heard the vow and blessed it. The years passed like pages, turning in a book Father Markovic never wanted to read. Zagreb, 2001, bishop's ring slipped onto his finger, while the cathedral congregation applauded his appointment, but he heard only the echo of hammers on wood, the sound of a carpenter building hope in impossible places. Rome, 2008. Cardinal's red hat placed upon his head in St. Peter's Basilica, while 10,000 faithful cheered. The scarlet symbolized willingness to shed blood for the faith, but he already carried the memory of blood spilled not his own. But Marco's, dried now into the grain of a cross, he carried everywhere like a splinter in his heart. Your Eminence shows remarkable humility, noted Cardinal Bertoli during a Vatican reception. Most newly appointed princes of the Church celebrate their elevation with more enthusiasm. Cardinal Markovic IV. He had kept his family name as his ecclesiastical signatures, smiled politely, and said nothing. How could he explain that every honor felt hollow? That every accolade reminded him of a man who had received no recognition for saving 17 lives? That he measured every achievement against the memory of calloused hands and quiet faith? The wooden cross had traveled with him through 28 years of appointments, transferred carefully from cassock to cassock, suitcase to suitcase. Hotel rooms in Geneva during ecumenical conferences, retreat houses in the Alps where he sought silence that never came, the papal apartments in Vatican City where he prayed for peace in the Balkans and found only the persistent ache of unfinished business. During his first address to the College of Cardinals, they expected theological brilliance, political acumen, perhaps insight into Eastern European affairs. Instead, Cardinal Markovic spoke about forgotten martyrs, about saints without hagiographies, about the sacred duty to remember those whom history overlooked. His colleagues listened politely, but their eyes held the subtle confusion of men who preferred their sanctity properly documented and canonically approved. You speak often of unnamed saints, observed Cardinal Toretti one evening after Vespers. Is there someone particular you have in mind? The promise burned in his chest like a pilot light never extinguished, always ready to ignite into the flame that would one day consume protocol and tradition alike. He was rising through the Church's hierarchy, every decision, every breath. The Sistine Chapel held the weight of 5 centuries as 117 cardinals filed through its ancient doors for the papal conclave of 2024. Of humanity's fall and redemption while red-capped princes of the Church, the cameras had been removed, the phones confiscated, the world locked out. Here, in this sacred isolation, the Holy Spirit would supposedly guide their choice of the next successor to St. Peter. But Cardinal Markovic felt only the familiar ache of a promise 29 years in the making. The early ballots scattered votes across familiar names: Cardinal O'Brien from Boston, Cardinal Silva from São Paulo, Cardinal Bertoli from the Curia. Black smoke rose from the chapel's chimney each evening, disappointing the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square below. By the 4th day, exhaustion settled over the conclave like incense that had grown too heavy. The Church needs fresh perspective, whispered Cardinal Toretti during the evening break, his voice echoing off the chapel's marble walls. Someone who understands suffering. The Eastern Europeans, they know persecution, displacement, the cost of faith under fire. Cardinal Markovic said nothing, but his fingers traced the outline of Marco's cross through the fabric of his cassock. When they spoke of suffering, they thought of statistics and geopolitical analyses. They had never knelt beside a carpenter's grave in Bosnia, never made a promise to a dead friend beneath a sky gray with smoke and ash. On the 7th ballot, something shifted. Votes began clustering around the quiet cardinal from Croatia, the man who spoke rarely but with devastating precision when he did speak. Cardinal Markovic watched the numbers climb with a strange detachment, as if observing someone else's destiny. Unfold: 63 votes, 71, 78, the 2/3, majority needed for election. When Cardinal Dean Sodano approached with the ritual question, "Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff?" time seemed suspended. Between heartbeats? Cardinal Markovic thought of Marco's final words. "Remember that some things are worth dying for, but love is the only thing worth living for." "I accept," he said quietly, "and I choose the name Leo XIV. The wooden cross burned against his chest. Like a brand, the promise, carried in silence for nearly 3 decades, was about to find its voice. White smoke would soon rise from the chimney, but the real fire had already been lit in a carpenter's workshop long ago. The papal apartments at Santa Marta had never felt more like a monastery cell than they did in the hours before dawn on May 20th, 2025. Pope Leo XIV sat alone at his simple wooden desk, the same piece of furniture he had insisted on keeping despite Vatican protocol suggesting something more befitting his office. Beyond his window, Rome slept beneath a canopy of stars, unaware that in a few hours their pontiff would shatter centuries of tradition. His hands trembled not from age or nervousness, but from the sacred weight of what lay before him on the desk. Marco's wooden cross, unwrapped from its linen shroud for the first time in months, seemed to pulse with its own quiet life in the candlelight. 29 years had darkened the wood, but the bloodstains remained visible in the grain-dark patches that spoke of sacrifice no Vatican archive would ever record. Pope Leo XIV lifted the cross, his thumb automatically finding the carved initials. MJ that Marco had etched into the base with his penknife during quiet evenings in the seminary. How many times had he traced these letters over the decades? In hotel rooms during episcopal conferences, in the cardinal's residence during sleepless nights, in the papal apartments during moments when the weight of his office threatened to crush the memory of his friend. "Tomorrow, Marco," he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible above the soft hum of the Vatican's ancient heating system. "Tomorrow, I keep the promise." The cross fit perfectly in his palm, just as it had that terrible night when Marco pressed it there with hands already cold from loss of blood. Pope Leo XIV could still hear his friend's final words. "Keep this. Remember that some things are worth dying for, but love is the only thing worth living for." The irony wasn't lost on him, a carpenter's simple cross, now resting in the hands of Peter's successor, soon to be carried into the most sacred basilica of the apostolic tradition. He studied the crude craftsmanship with an art historian's eye, noting the uneven cuts, the places where Marco's knife had slipped slightly. Any museum curator would dismiss it as peasant work, unworthy of display. But Pope Leo XIV saw what the experts missed: the devotion in every imperfect line, the love carved into wood by hands that built shelter for the desperate. The cross would ride tomorrow over his heart, hidden beneath papal vestments, carrying with it the weight of a promise that had shaped every decision of his clerical life. In a few hours, the world would witness something unprecedented. They would see protocol shattered, tradition broken. The Pope of Rome lying prostrate before St. Paul's tomb, but they would never understand why unless someone remembered the carpenter who died building hope in impossible places. Never stopped rolling, but they captured nothing the world could understand. CNN's Vatican correspondent whispered urgently into her microphone. "We're witnessing unprecedented behavior from Pope Leo XIV. He's been prostrate on the marble floor for nearly 7 minutes now, and no one seems to know why." Her voice carried the bewilderment of a seasoned reporter watching her prepared script crumble into irrelevance. In the basilica's press section, photographers lowered their cameras after the initial shots, uncertain whether they were documenting a medical emergency or a mystical experience. The prepared questions about missionary work and evangelization seemed absurd now, scattered like Cardinal Toretti's homily across the marble floor. This wasn't a photo opportunity, was something ancient and inexplicable unfolding in real time. Cardinal Bertoli stood frozen near the altar, his face cycling through confusion, concern, and finally a kind of awed recognition. He had served in the Vatican for 37 years, witnessed 5 papal conclaves, attended countless liturgical ceremonies, but he had never seen anything like this: a pope abandoning all protocol to lie face down before an apostle's tomb, whispering a name that meant nothing to anyone present. "Marco," Pope Leo XIV had said, the word floating into the basilica's vaulted silence like incense seeking heaven. "We finished." In the third pew, a young priest from Bosnia gripped the wooden armrest until his knuckles went white. Father Petkovic had been 8 years old in 1995. Living in a refugee camp outside Zagreb when his parents whispered stories of miracles happening in besieged seminaries. Stories of carpenters who became saints, of priests who carried promises like crosses. He stared at the prostrate figure of the Pope and felt something ancient stirring in his memory. The Vatican security team exchanged glances through their earpieces, trained to protect the Holy Father from external threats, but helpless before whatever internal compulsion had brought him to his knees. Swiss guards stood like statues, their ceremonial halberds suddenly feeling inadequate for guarding whatever sacred mystery was unfolding before them. Outside, St. Peter's Square filled with pilgrims staring at phones and tablets, watching live streams of their pontiff doing something no pope in history had ever done. Twitter erupted with hashtags nobody understood, hashtag who is Marco, hashtag Pope broken, hashtag Vatican. The digital age demanded immediate explanation for what could only be comprehended through decades of patient remembrance. But inside the Basilica, time moved differently. 7 minutes felt like 7 years, or perhaps 7 seconds, as the world watched their Pope honor a promise older than his papacy, deeper than ceremony, holier than any tradition. Cardinal Turretti approached cautiously, his prepared homily forgotten, his ecclesiastical training useless against the gravity of whatever was happening before Paul's tomb. When Pope Leo XIV finally rose from the marble floor, his white cassock bore the dust of centuries and the weight of a promise kept. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man emerging from deep water. Cardinal Turretti stepped forward instinctively, but the Pope's raised hand stopped him not with authority, but with the gentle gesture of someone still dwelling in sacred space. "Holy Father," Cardinal Turretti whispered, his voice barely audible. "In the vast basilica, the homily shall we proceed with. There will be no homily today," Pope Leo XIV said quietly, his eyes still fixed on Paul's tomb. "Some truths are too large for words." In the third pew, Father Petkovic stood suddenly, his face pale as communion bread. The name the Pope had whispered Marcoechoed in chambers of memory long sealed. He was no longer a 37-year-old priest, but an 8-year-old boy in a refugee camp. Listening to his grandmother tell stories of the saint who had no feast day, Marco Giovanovi, Father Petkovic said aloud, his voice cracking like ice in spring. The words carried across the basilica's silence with startling clarity. Pope Leo XIV turned his eyes, meeting those of the young Bosnian priest across the sea of confused faces. Recognition passed between them like lightning seeking ground. Here was someone who remembered, someone who knew that miracles happened in carpenter shops and seminary courtyards, not just in Vatican ceremonies. You knew him. Pope Leo XIV's question was barely a whisper, but in the basilica's acoustics, it reached every ear present. Father Petkovic nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My parents, they were in the seminary of St. Cyril. They told me about the carpenter who saved 17 people, who died so others could live." He paused, his voice breaking. "They said a young priest made a promise at his grave. They said he would never forget." The basilica erupted in confused murmurs. Cameras swiveled toward the crying priest. Vatican officials exchanged frantic glances. But Pope Leo XIV heard only the sound of chains, breaking chains of silence he had worn for 29 years. "Marco taught me that love is the only thing worth living for," the Pope said, his voice growing stronger. "Today, I keep the promise I made to him. Today, the Church remembers a saint it never canonized." He reached beneath his cassock and withdrew the wooden cross, holding it aloft where the morning light could catch its scarred surface. This is his cross. This is his story. This is why protocol matters less than promises, and tradition bows before truth. The silence that followed was not empty, it was pregnant with recognition, heavy with the weight of witnessing something eternal break into time. 3 months after Pope Leo XIV broke protocol at St. Paul's tomb, the ripples of that moment continued to spread across the world like circles on still water, reaching shores no Vatican document had ever touched. In Sarajevo, what had once been the bombed-out ruins of the seminary of St. Cyril now drew pilgrims from across the globe, not because of any official church designation, but because of something far more powerful, a story that had found its voice after 29 years of silence. The small plaque mounted beside the rebuilt chapel bore no gilded letters, no Vatican seal, no formal ecclesiastical language. Instead, simple words were carved in 3 languages: Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian, the same tongues that had once carried hatred, now united in memory. Marko Jovanović, 1961 to 1995. He built hope in impossible places. Below the inscription, someone had carved a rough wooden cross, matching the one that had traveled from this courtyard to the heart of the Vatican and back again. Father Petković, now appointed as the chapel's guardian by unanimous consent of the Bosnian bishops, had become an unlikely custodian of miracles. Every morning, he unlocked the simple wooden case that housed Marko's cross, the same cross that had rested against Pope Leo XIV's heart for 29 years. The wood had darkened with age and handling, the bloodstains more prominent now, like sacred stigmata preserved in oak and ash. Visitors could touch it, hold it, understand through their fingertips that sanctity lived in splinters and sacrifice, not just in marble and gold. He was my age when he died, Father Petković told a group of theology students from Zagreb one afternoon, his voice carrying the weight of inherited memory. 34 years old, a carpenter who learned his trade from his father, who learned it from his grandfather. 3 generations of men who built churches with their hands. He paused, watching the students trace the rough edges of Marko's cross. But Marko built something more than churches. He built tomorrow in a place where tomorrow seemed impossible. The students listened with the intensity of those encountering sacred ground for the first time. One young woman, barely 20, asked the question that came to every visitor: why isn't he a saint? Why isn't there a feast day, a formal canonization process? Father Petković smiled, the same gentle expression that had marked his face since that moment in St. Paul's Basilica. When he had recognized the name whispered by the Pope, because some sanctity is too large for ceremony, some love too deep for documents, the Church tried to contain Marko's story in official channels. Once committees were formed, investigations launched, testimonies gathered, but his story kept escaping, finding its way into hearts that never read Vatican pronouncements. In Rome, Pope Leo XIV continued his papal duties with a transformation that surprised even his closest aides. The weight he had carried for 3 decades, the burden of a promise unfulfilled, the ache of a story untold had lifted, leaving behind something rarer than papal authority: peace. His homilies took on a different character, speaking not of theological abstractions, but of carpenters and teachers, nurses and mechanics, ordinary people who had chosen extraordinary love in moments when the world offered them easier paths, the Church's greatest saints. Pope Leo XIV said during a general audience in St. Peter's Square, his voice carrying across the ancient stones with the authority of personal witness: are not always those whose names appear in martyrologies or whose faces shine from stained glass windows. Sometimes they are carpenters who choose to stay when others flee, who build tomorrow while today burns around them. Sometimes they are mothers who share their last piece of bread with strangers, fathers who carry other people's children to safety, teachers who risk their lives to preserve knowledge, doctors who remain at their posts when hospitals become targets. The crowd of 30,000 fell silent, sensing they were hearing something unprecedented: a pope speaking not from doctrine but from memory, not from tradition but from trauma transformed into testimony. He continued, his voice growing stronger. I knew such a man once. His name was Marko Jovanović, and he taught me that love is the only thing worth living for. The world never heard his name until 3 months ago, but heaven has known it for 29 years. At the seminary of St. Cyril, now rebuilt and thriving with students from across the Balkans, a new tradition had taken root organically, without official sanction or liturgical approval. Every June 15th, the anniversary of Marko's death, students gathered in the chapel at sunset to light 17 candles, one for each life he had saved. They spoke his name aloud, as Pope Leo XIV had taught them, because memory spoken becomes prayer, and prayer spoken becomes eternal. The ceremony drew visitors from around the world, but it remained intentionally simple. No cameras were allowed inside during the lighting, no recordings were made, no live streams broadcast the moment to distant audiences. This was not performance, but remembrance, not spectacle, but sanctuary. Father Petković would read the names of the 17 survivors, those who had lived, because Marko had chosen to die. Most were dead now themselves, claimed by time and age. But their children and grandchildren came to speak their parents' names. And Marco's in the same breath. "He saved my mother," said Anna Kovac, now a grandmother herself, holding her 4-year-old granddaughter's hand as they stood before Marco's cross. She was 19, pregnant with my brother, terrified. Marco helped her hide in the chapel, told her stories about the saints to keep her calm while the shooting went on outside. She said he had the gentlest voice she'd ever heard, like someone reading bedtime stories instead of prayers for the dying. As the candles burned down to stubs and the last visitors departed, Father Petkovic would remain alone in the chapel. Sitting in the same spot where Marco had knelt 30 years ago, polishing wood and whispering scripture, the silence would settle around him like a blessing, heavy with presence, rich with the kind of peace that comes not from the absence of suffering but from its transformation into love. The fire Marco had lit in a carpenter's workshop in 19 burned brighter than ever, tended now by millions who understood that love, not ceremony, makes saints of ordinary people. It was a fire that needed no official recognition to warm hearts, no papal approval to light the way forward, no canonical process to prove its authenticity. It simply burned, as love always burns, consuming everything false and leaving only what is eternal, the memory of a man who chose to build tomorrow in a place where tomorrow seemed impossible. In Vatican City, Pope Leo XIV would sometimes stand at his window overlooking St. Peter's Square and think of that fire burning in a rebuilt chapel in Bosnia, tended by people who had never asked permission to remember their saint, and he would smile, touching the place over his heart where Marco's cross had rested for 29 years, knowing that some promises once kept continue keeping themselves for all eternity.